let's just notice some things in the text. Just what's going on in the story that Jill's just read. What's worthy of note? Well, this is the 7th miracle, and John's only going to write about 7. So this is the sort of the final one. The first one was a marriage, a scene of a marriage about the lack of wine. And here, the 7th one begins with death, begins at a funeral, begins with a marriage, ends with a funeral. 7th, perfect number. Second thing is, it's the longest story by far. And it's how the first half of the gospel ends. So from here on in, the gospel, the first 11 chapters have taken 3 years. From chapter 12 through to 21 is going to be about 10 days. All right? So you've got this sort of 2 halves of John's gospel going on. This is the final moment of the first half of the gospel. Lazarus is named. It's the only miracle in John's gospel that names the person for whom the miracle was done. You don't know the names of anybody else that was healed, that was set free. You don't know the person whose wedding it was in Cana. Lazarus is named. It's the only one where you see Jesus' emotion so clearly. Jesus weeps at the tomb. It's the only time you see his emotions so clearly. And it's the first time in John's gospel you've seen Jesus praying. Now, there's going to be, in the next half of the gospel, you're going to be seeing that a lot more, and that'll give you an insight into Jesus' mind and his heart. But this is the first time you've seen Jesus pray. And it's the first time you've heard Jesus shout. The rest of the miracles have all been very calm, very quiet, very unseen in many ways. But this one, Jesus, you hear him shouting. And you see the centrality of love. The one you love has died. Jesus loved Martha and Mary. And then other people say of him, see how he loved. And it's the miracle where life gets the last word. John, I've wanted to say all the way through this series on the sermons I've been preaching, that John is a careful writer. And he's leading you by the hand, and you're supposed to notice some stuff. And what John expects of his readers is that they will have reread the gospel over and over again. Because I don't know if you noticed, and why necessarily would you, but right at the beginning of chapter 11, where John is writing about, sort of setting the scene, as it were, he writes this. A man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. In brackets, this Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Close brackets. It's only a small thing, this. We've not read that yet. That's in chapter 12. So what John's expecting you to do is make the links. He's expecting you've read this and now you're rereading it. It's her. Otherwise, it's a very strange way of writing about where this is happening. So far, as I said, the Gospels have been about who is Jesus. Because if you're going to follow him, you need to know him. But this miracle is, how does Jesus operate? What does Jesus do? And there's so much detail in this chapter that you get a sense of, it's more than John just going, actually, I've got a really long tale to tell and I'd love you to know all the details. It's almost like John is preaching to you about not necessarily just who Jesus is, but how does Jesus work? So let's have a look. What do you notice? Well, 3 things to begin with. He loves, he hears, and he waits. He gets news, your friend is dying. And he loves this friend, and he waits. Why doesn't he go immediately? Why doesn't he just go and stop him dying? Jesus has got a track record of healing sick people. And yet in this situation, he just waits because he's got a plan. And the plan is that they might see God's glory. You see, the difficult thing for us in our life with God is this. God works in ways that he wants, not in ways always that we want. God does not always react to the things that we think are the most urgent. From time to time, this week I was doing it again. From time to time, I do some teaching with some students at a college, at a theological college. And so this week, it was just one full week of master's teaching. But in talking to the students, I will say to them quite regularly, look, if you want me to respond, then you need to make sure that you're asking me in good time. And I've got this phrase I picked up someone. I think someone said it to me, is, your urgency is not my priority. Your urgency is not my priority. And you might think it's a bit mean, but I wonder whether sometimes it's exactly the way it is with God. Your urgency is not his priority. Because your urgency comes out of, God, you've got to do this. And God goes, I've got a plan here, and I'm going to ask you to trust me. He's got a plan. Jesus, this is the good news, risks his life for God's plan. The disciples go, Jesus, you can't go back. They're going to kill you. And he goes, no, it's okay. I'll risk my life for my friends. And then he develops the bigger picture. So Martha comes out. She rushes out to see him. And she says, Lazarus, your friend has been dying and he's now dead. And Jesus asks her, do you believe in the resurrection? And she says, I know at the end there'll be the resurrection of the dead. And he said, yeah, but I am the resurrection. Do you believe that? And I think what Jesus is doing in that interplay with Martha is he's doing this thing where he goes, I know you know the right answer, but do you believe it? Do you really believe it? You know that thing we say to one another, when one of us is going through a hard time and someone else will go, God loves you, God cares for you, he will come through for you, he's not forgotten you. And if you're the one in pain, you're the one going through the hard time, it's like, yeah, I know that. But I think that's what's going on with Martha. Yeah, I know that. And Jesus is sort of like drawing it out of her and going, yeah, but do you really believe? In other words, it's easy to have all the right answers, but do you believe? And he develops that bigger picture. The other thing he does is this. He receives disappointments. Mary goes to him and says, Jesus, if you'd been here, if you'd have come when we asked, he wouldn't have died. If you'd have come, he wouldn't have died. Jesus didn't tell her off. He doesn't say, who do you think you are? He doesn't say, you've no idea, woman. He receives it. I don't think God's ever worried about our honesty. There's a form of prayer that's called lament. A lament is where you're saying to God, God, it's a mess. How long, oh God, are we going to have to live with this? How long, God, will we live with this? And behind the lament is this: God, if you wanted, you could click your fingers and it could change. How long, God? How long? And God never says, who do you think you are? He receives our own disappointments. At the beginning of the service, that sort of off-the-cuff thing, tell me your story about how you got saved. It's a long story. And in the midst of a long story, there are times where you're going, God, if only you had acted differently. And it might be that in the room today, there's some of you going, do you know what, God? If you'd have done it, then things would have been so different. If you'd have heard my prayer earlier, then it would have been so different. And what does Jesus do with Mary? He doesn't turn her away. He walks with her to the tomb. And two things we're told about Jesus. One, he gets angry, and one, he weeps. What's he angry about? He's not angry with Mary. He's not angry with everybody who's weeping. I think he's angry at the situation. I think Jesus stands with us, and I think he shares our indignation at the things that you have to watch. And he weeps. Now, Jesus knew what he was going to do, so why is he weeping? Who's he weeping for? Well, not for Lazarus, because in about 5 minutes' time, he's going to shout really loud, and Lazarus is going to come walking out of that tomb. Who's he weeping with? He's weeping with Mary. Jesus, who intercedes for us, stands with us. And then, finally, in the story we've just heard, what does he do? He asks for cooperation. He says to the folks, can you move away the stone? You move it. And you get that brilliant interchange. I don't think you want to do that, Jesus. He's going to stink. It's kind of like, it feels like the least of our problems right now, yeah? It's kind of like, in the light of everything else that we're feeling right now, the fact that he might be a bit smelly, this doesn't feel like the biggest problem that Jesus is going to have to encounter. But they come and they go, we know how these stories end. These stories always end in death. And he says to the folks there, will you open the tomb? And then Jesus prays. And it's one of those prayers where, as it's being recounted, Jesus is praying not because he doesn't know what he's going to do, or he doesn't know the Father, and that he doesn't know what the Father wants. He's praying so that we who listen might hear Jesus pray. He prays, and then he does this brilliant miracle of calling the dead back to life. And Lazarus walks out, bound in all the bandages. And Jesus says, unwrap him. He's good to live. Wouldn't you have loved to have been there? Wouldn't you have loved to be there? You just hear Jesus shouting, Lazarus, come out. It's time to live, boy. It's time to live. Take off the grave clothes. It's time to live. In the middle of the story, the key kind of verse or so is this, where Jesus says to Martha, I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And that's when Martha says, I believe it's going to happen at the end. And he goes, well, I'm going to show you what it looks like when it happens now. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? I'm the resurrection and the life. I'm the one that brings life in dead situations. I'm the one that brings people who feel they've been dead back to life. It's the song we sang at the beginning of the service. It's the story that some of us would want to tell. There was a time when I was dead, but now I'm alive. I was lost, but now I'm found. I was a long way from home, but I've come home. How and what made that possible? Well, in the piece that follows that we stopped reading at the end of that story, you get this interplay between the high priest and the people who were in charge, because the people in charge hate the idea that dead people come back to life. Because people who are in charge essentially just need to know that the way the status quo is will always be the status quo. We'll always keep it just. We don't like not knowing what's going to happen next. We don't like losing control. One of the Pharisees named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up and said, "You know nothing at all. You don't realize it's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." Because they knew that if people were coming back to life, then actually the Romans would start to step in and maybe they would lose their nation. So Caiaphas says, actually what's better is let's just kill one person rather than us all die. And John writes, he didn't say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and to make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. It's the bit in italics there that's so important. The Caiaphas, he's just pragmatic. He goes, if we can get rid of one man, we might be able to live. If kill one, we all might live. And John says he didn't realize that actually by one man dying, everyone would live. That's what it means to follow the resurrected Lord. And the resurrection of life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And I suppose, in a sense, the one simple thing I want to say is, do we believe it? And if we believe it, what does it change? If you believe that Jesus brings dead people who are dead in sin, people who are dead in loss, people who are dead in grief, people who are dead to all that God wants. If Jesus brings life now and we never die, we will, of course, our physical life will come to an end, but we will never die. You'll always be alive to God. You'll always be aware of his presence. There will be never a moment where God's presence will not be with you. Whether you're 25 or 85. Whether you're at the beginning of your life or actually much of life has gone by. There's never a moment where the presence of God will not be with you. And when we do a funeral for you and we celebrate all that you've ever been, you will be more aware of the presence of God on that day than any other day in your life. The future only ever gets bigger, not smaller. And in the rest of life, the truth is that as you get older, it can feel like your life is getting smaller. You can't do what you used to be able to do. Some things just are not possible. It feels like it's sort of like coming down. But with the resurrection, your life's only ever going to get bigger. What difference does the hope of the resurrection mean on our worst days? Outwardly, we're wasting away, Paul says. Bits of us are stopping working day by day. Inwardly, though, being renewed. But today, some of you stand outside a proverbial tomb. And it looks like the situation is at an end. And it can feel like you're outside a tomb, crying, thinking it shouldn't have ended like this. It's a whole range of things. Let me go back to all that Jesus does. He loves and he hears and he waits. He's got a plan. He risks his life and he's got a bigger picture. And he receives our disappointment and he weeps with us and he asks for cooperation. He prays and he calls the dead to life. I'm the resurrection of the life. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? Do you believe it not just that one day I might be raised from the dead, but do you believe that in the things that you feel are the scenes of death right now, that Jesus stands with you and says, my delay is not because I've lost control, but actually I'm working out a plan for the glory of God. And there's some days, the truth is, the honest truth is, some days you go, well, I don't know how that will be, and I'm not sure I can believe that, but I trust you. I don't see how that can be. It's not what I would have chosen. It's not the way I would have wanted it, but I trust you. I trust you. Jesus stands with us before the miracle. Going, do you trust me? And so we live our lives between the tomb and the resurrection. You see, I wonder what Lazarus said the next day. Do you know what I mean? When he turned up for work again. Have you been away? Yeah. Long weekend. Where you been? You wouldn't believe it. You're looking well. I know. And one day Lazarus, of course, would die again. But he would die finally knowing that he'd lived in the midst of death. You're standing perhaps this morning outside a tomb. Jesus walks with you to the scene where everything seems to be going wrong. He stands with you at the scene where everything seems to be going wrong. He cries with you. He weeps with you when everything is seeming to be going wrong. And he calls and he shouts. And the shout is a shout of defiance. It's Jesus shouting so that everybody else can hear. Come out. You see, in this story, Jesus gets the last word. In this story, death doesn't get the final word. In this story, life gets the final word. It's the seventh sign. It's the seventh thing that points to Jesus. It's the seventh event where John is not just saying, can you see who Jesus is, but can you see how Jesus walked with us? And it's the seventh sign that says he's still doing it.